In this video, I'm going to show how you can build payments into an Airbnb style property rental app built on Bubble. You'll see here we're looking to reserve this property for 7 nights, and when we click on the reserve button, we're brought to the checkout page. We're going to pay $2,495 in total. That's going to be split between the host, who's going to get 80% of that value, and then also the platform, who's going to get 20%. We're going to use Stripe Connect to achieve that. When we click on the checkout button, you'll see we're going to be brought to this really nice Stripe checkout page. I'm going to quickly fill in these details. And then when we click on pay, that payment is going to go through. And when we go to our Stripe dashboard in a second, we should see that that gets split between the platform and between the host. You can see the total payment value is $2,495. But if we go to the collected fees tab here, you'll see $499 of that is actually going to the platform itself. The host in this case was Tom Hanks at testmail.com. He's going to get the rest of that value. I'm also going to show you some more advanced tricks like how to process refunds, how to track the status of a transaction over time. If you go into our database, you'll see here that under the transactions data type, we have this payment intent status, which is going to tell us when a payment has succeeded, when it was failed, and when it requires further action. I'm also going to show how you can capture payment details at one point in time and then actually trigger the transaction at a later point. This can be useful if you want to give your guests a grace period of a week or so to cancel a reservation before actually making the payment. Throughout this tutorial, we're going to be using the Stripe Connect Marketplace plugin. This is a paid plugin I've developed myself. You can find it by clicking on the Add Plugins tab up here and searching for Stripe Connect Marketplace. I'm also going to put a link to this plugin in the description below. Once we've installed the Stripe Connect Marketplace plugin, we need to do some quick configuration, but nothing too difficult. And we need to fill out these 3 fields here. We're going to also need to fill out the above 3 when we're deploying to live, but we're just going to focus on the test mode keys for now. Where you're going to get these API keys is in your Stripe dashboard. And note for this tutorial, I have assumed that you've already set up a Stripe account. If you haven't, there's plenty of tutorials out there on how to do so. You will also need to have enabled Stripe Connect. Once you've done all that, go to the developer section of your Stripe dashboard and note that I am in test mode at the moment. Go to the API key section and then copy the publishable key. You can click to copy that. Go back to your Bubble editor. I'm just going to delete these so we know exactly what we're doing. So I've copied the publishable key and I'm simply going to paste it in here straight from the Stripe dashboard. The next key we need to get is our secret key. So I'm going to reveal this now. That's okay because we're on test mode. I would certainly not be doing this if I was on production mode. I'm going to copy that secret key. I'm going to go back to my Bubble editor and I'm going to paste that in the Stripe secret key dev field. And finally, we need to put something in for our API key dev. This is actually pretty straightforward. All we're going to do is we're going to type in the word bearer, put in a space, and then paste in the secret key once more. So we're actually taking the secret key that we pasted in down here, putting it in the API key dev field, but just putting in bearer and a space beforehand. So now that we have our Stripe Connect plugin configured, we can go about building our workflows. And the very first thing we're going to need to do is to onboard our merchants. In marketplace apps, merchants are considered those users who are selling the good or service, which in this case is going to be our Airbnb host. So if we just refresh, we're currently signed in as Jane Bridges at testmail.com, who's a customer, but the merchant is going to be the Airbnb host behind this particular property. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first of all log out our customer Jane Bridges. You'll see she's now logged out, and I'm going to sign up an Airbnb host. So I'm going to go to the sign in tab here. I'm going to go to create a new account. And let's just take a quick look as to what's happening here behind the host sign up workflow. Let's go back to our Bubble editor. Let's go to the sign in page. That's the login card over there. What we need to do is we need to find the sign up one. So let's just click on this and let's find out where the sign up card is. There it is. And what's happening when we click on this sign up flow here? What we're doing is we're signing the user up, we're resetting the relevant inputs, and then we're sending them to the dashboard. There's actually one more change I want to make. And before I do that, let's just take a look at our database and have a look at the user data type. What you'll see here is we have a number of custom fields on the user data type. We have the standard ones that come with Bubble automatically, but then we also have this field called charges enabled. And what this is going to do, it's going to let us know whether the user has successfully signed up for a Stripe Connect account or not, because they can only accept payments if they have signed up for a Stripe account. So we're going to check that in a minute. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to define whether the user is a customer or a host. And just to do that in the actual sign up workflow itself, what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert another action here. I'm going to say make changes to the current user. I'm going to say customer host equals host. Going back to our database, you'll see we also have this data type called listings. And what this essentially is, it's a list of listings or a list of properties you might otherwise describe it as that this particular user is in charge of. So we'll see here, we'll go through this in a minute, but the listings has a lot of fields associated with it as well. The name of the user, we don't have to get that, but it can be useful. Profile photo, again, optional, but this is definitely very important. It's the Stripe ID, and that's going to represent the Stripe account ID of this particular user, who is going to be the Airbnb host or the merchant, as we called them earlier. So let's go and sign someone up. So let's say we're going to sign up a host, and we're going to call them John Wayne. And we'll just put in a dummy email address and a dummy password. So we're now going to sign them up. We're going to register them as a user. We're going to make sure that they're a host. And we're brought to this dashboard area here. And I'm not going to go into the kind of intricacies of how this dashboard is laid out. But what's important from our point of view is you can add listings. But before you do so, you need to connect a Stripe account in the profile section. So you'll see here, this is the user's email. We can see their charges enabled is currently down as no. And just to show you how that works, you'll see here I'm setting the type of data on this particular group to user, and I'm saying this user's charges enabled is no. And what's going to happen when we register a Stripe account is we want to create a couple of actions here. The first thing we want to do is we want to go to here, and we want to go to plugins, and we want to go to Stripe Connect, create Express account. So this is the very first action. It's actually going to create a Stripe Express account for the current user. In this case, it's going to be johnwayne@testmail.com. And we have these fields that we need to fill out. So you can see here the country by default is down as the US. If we look at the documentation, we'll see that we can pick from quite a range of countries. You can see the full list at this link here, but we have to use this 2-digit country code. And again, this can be found at the link below. Let's just take a quick look at that. And you'll see here, these are all the 2-digit codes that we can use as this input. I'm based in Ireland, so is my platform. So what I'm actually going to use is this IE code here. So let's go back. Let's replace that US with IE. For email, we're going to use the current user's email. For payout interval, this is where we need to decide how often the user is going to get paid out their funds from Stripe. So let's say you're an Airbnb host, you do a couple of bookings a week. Do you want to get paid out those funds on a daily basis? Do you want to get paid out on a weekly? Or do you want to get paid out on a monthly? I'm going to pick monthly here. And because I picked monthly, I need to choose my monthly anchor. This is essentially the day in the month on which the host gets paid out the funds. So if I pick 1, they're going to get paid out on the first day of the month. If I pick 30, they're going to get paid out on the last day of the month, or if there's 30 days in a month, they'll get paid out on that. I'm going to pick 25, so they're going to get paid out on the 25th day of every month. If I had chosen weekly as my payout interval here, I'd have to choose a weekly anchor, and that's the day of the week on which the merchant gets paid out from Stripe. That's the first step in registering a merchant for their own Stripe Connect account. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to make changes to a thing. The thing we're going to change is the current user. And what we're going to change is we're going to change, first of all, their Stripe ID. Because we just created a Stripe Connect Express account for them, And what that means is we can get the Stripe ID that's associated with that account and save it down to our database. It's really simple. All we need to do is we need to go down here and go to result of step 1 and choose Stripe account ID. The next thing we want to do is we want to actually create a way for this merchant to onboard via Stripe. Even though we've created an Express account from this stage, they haven't actually fully registered. They need to fill out quite a few details. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to plugins again, and we're going to go to Stripe Connect, create onboarding link. There's 3 fields we need to fill out here. The very first one is their Stripe account ID. Luckily, we just saved that down. So we could actually get this in 2 ways. We could either get it as a result of step 1 or as a result of step 2. I'm going to go with a result of step 1 and go with that Stripe account ID again. The next thing we need to fill out is this refresh URL. This is basically the URL the user is sent to if they leave the sign-up flow or for some reason the link that we've created here is going to be expired. What we're going to do is you could just manually type in a URL, so you could send them to google.com, but that's not particularly useful. What you're going to want to do in most cases is redirect them to their dashboard or some place in the app where they're likely to take an action next. What I'm going to do is, rather than typing in a specific URL, I'm going to use this insert dynamic data action here, and then I'm going to go down to this URL. That's the URL the user was already on before they left to complete their onboarding on Stripe. I do want to signify that the user didn't finish their onboarding, or it didn't work as expected, or the link expired. And the way I'm going to do that is by putting in a page URL parameter. And the way I'm going to do that is by putting a parameter in the URL that the user is returned to. I can do that by putting a question mark in here, and I'm going to put in refresh equals true. This will become more obvious in a few minutes once we actually complete the onboarding process. The return URL is very similar, but it's where the user is redirected to after they successfully completed their sign up. I'm going to do exactly the same thing here. I'm going to copy this URL here. I'm going to paste it in, but instead of refresh equals true, I'm going to change that to return equals true. We have one more step in our onboarding process here before we actually get to see the merchant being onboarded, and it's really simple. All we need to do is we need to go to navigation. We want to open an external website, and then we want to go to the URL that was created as a result of step 3. Let's test this out. Let's go back to our dashboard, and let's click on the register Stripe account button. Okay, so you can see we're being redirected to this Stripe page. And the first thing you'll notice is branding here on the left side. It's for some sort of app called Qualified. That is the name of one of my old Stripe accounts. I'm just using it here for dummy purposes. You can set up your own branding and your own company's name within your Stripe dashboard. Let's go through the onboarding process. This is going to be different on your page potentially, because depending on the country that the merchant is based in, the sign-up flow is different. Different countries require different details, therefore Stripe asks you for different things depending on where you're based. You can see we're in test mode at the moment, so this is only a test account that we're signing up. I'm going to use a test phone number here. So let's use that test code. Again, these are really country-specific details here. I'm just going to go with continue on the individual/sole trader. I'm going to blast through this very quickly and put in some dummy data, and let's continue. It's asking us to choose our industry. It's going to go with software, and let's just put in google.com. Asking for bank account details. Again, I'm going to use a test account here. And we can submit our details. Some countries will require more details, but that's all we need to set up our Irish Stripe Express account. Okay, so we've been redirected to our dashboard, and I want to point out a few things here. First of all, let's look at the URL up here. You can see that at the end of it, we have this return equals true parameter that has been put in at the end. You might remember we did put that in when we were initially creating our onboarding flow. And then the second thing I want to show to you is our charges enabled have changed to yes. We didn't do anything there. That's because I already had a workflow in there that was handling that. And what I was doing is I'm actually going to delete that and recreate it. What I did was I said when the page is loaded and when get data from page URL, and I'm saying when the parameter name return, and when I'm saying that is true, then we're going to do something. So we're only going to do this action when return equals true is in the page URL. And the thing I was going to do was I was going to make changes to the current user, and I wanted to change their charges enabled. And the way I was going to decide to change their charges enabled was I'm going to get data from an external API. The API provider here is going to be something that comes with the plugin. You should see you have all these details. And I'm going to go to Stripe Connect, retrieve account details. This is going to require an account ID. So Stripe's going to need to know which account to look up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to current users, Stripe ID, because we've saved that down already. And then what I'm going to do is I can choose from a bunch of things here. It's really useful. There's a lot of data we can pull in. But what I want to check is whether the charges enabled is true or not. You can see this value is to a yes or no field. So this means that when the page reloads, we're going to update that depending on what Stripe says. It's not obvious that this works here because I've already done it, but maybe just to give you an example, what I could do is I could say, instead of saying Stripe Connect retrieve account details, I could just say no. Let's just assume that this user has not successfully been onboarded. Because this return equals true is in the URL parameter, it's going to update this charges enabled back to no. But we don't want that. Let's go back to what we had a second ago. And refresh one more time. And we should see this update from no to yes. Okay, now that we've successfully registered this merchant, you should see that we have the ability to add listings. How did I do that? Very simple. If we go back to that particular page, you'll notice that this big group here that has all the information, when the current user's charges enabled is no, so when they haven't registered successfully for a Stripe account, this isn't visible. When they have registered, when it's yes, it is visible. And then I've done the inverse with this group down here, which just has that little warning. So that's all quite straightforward. I'm not going to go through the process of adding a new listing for our host here. I'm just going to manually kind of give them a few properties so you can see what's happening. So going back to our dashboard, what we'll see is if we go to listings now, I've assigned these two listings to the user that we've just created, the John Wayne at testmail.com. If we go into our database, we can see how this has been structured. As I mentioned, listings are the properties that people can rent, and each listing has an owner, which is a user type. And if we go into the two most recent properties in our database, you'll see here this one, the owner is John Wayne at testmail.com, and also for this one, John Wayne at testmail.com. This means that whenever a user tries to rent out one of these properties, the merchant or the host behind them is John Wayne at testmail.com. So I'm going to log out because we've done the hard work on registering the merchant, and we now want to look at how you can actually rent these properties and split the payments between John Wayne at testmail.com and the platform itself. Instead of signing up a new user, I'm just going to go into my database and go to that test user that we had earlier. That's Jane Bridges at testmail.com. You can see here, rather than being a host, she is a customer. So if we pick one of the John Wayne properties that he owns, which is these two here, and we click on that, what we'll see is we're brought to a page that shows a property. It has a few photos, it has some of the details of the property, and a description that's full of placeholder text. Now, what is crucial is this section over here on the right-hand side. What we're doing is we're showing the price per night, multiplying that by the number of nights for which the user is staying in the property or would like to, adding on a cleaning fee, and then getting to a total fee. I think it's probably worth delving into the database again just to show how that's structured. You'll see here under data types, each listing has a cleaning fee, which is a one-off number, and it also has a price per night. And if we go into the two properties that John Wayne is the owner of. We'll see here, for example, for this 19 Dutch Street property, that the price per night is 350 and the cleaning fee is 45. When we go back to the actual listing page itself and we look at that section on the right hand side, this looks quite complex, but in reality what's going on here is I'm just doing a few simple calculations to get to the total price. You can see here I'm taking the checkout date and then taking away the check-in date to get a number of days, multiplying that by the price per night, and then adding on the cleaning fee as well. You will notice I have these parentheses here in the expression. This is something you actually have to enable. It's not a feature that comes with Bubble, but if you go to versions in your settings tab, you can see here that I've ticked the parentheses. You don't have to use them, but I just find it easier to do complex calculations when you do have them ticked. So once we've chosen our dates, and let's just change to the 10th through to the 15th, and I click on this reserve button, a couple of things are happening. Let's take a look at that workflow there. What we're actually doing is we're creating a new trip. Trip is a very similar data type to listing, but the difference is you can obviously have multiple trips based on the same listing. If we just look at it in our database, you'll see it has a lot of the same information as the listing data type. It has the cleaning fee, it has the end date, it has a start date, price per night, total price, nights, and then the customer, which in this case is going to be our janebridges@testmail.com. So once we click on the listing, we're creating a new trip and we're populating all of these fields here. There's nothing too complex about what I'm doing here. I'm just taking the end date from the date picker, I'm taking the start date from the date picker, and all the rest of the information is pretty straightforward. What I'm going to do then is I'm going to send the user to this page book. And if we look at page book, you'll see that this page has the type of content set to trip. We just go back to our listing page and look at that workflow. You'll see that when we go to that page, we're sending the trip that we're creating in step 1. So maybe just to have a look at the book page, we'll do a test booking here. So $350 per night by 5 nights, that gets us $17.50. Add on the cleaning fee and we get to $17.95. On the book page, we're pulling in a lot of the data from that trip. Now, you may wonder how exactly am I getting that data? Very straightforward. If we go into book and go into design, you'll see here I'm just pulling in parent groups trips price per night multiplied by the number of nights. That gets $350 by 5 nights. And again, it's very similar to what we had on the actual book page itself. What is more interesting about this page is our 2 payment options. What we can do is we can either pay in full now or we can pay at a later date. I'm going to come back to the pay later. I think it's quite interesting and something kind of unique you can do with this plugin. For now, we're going to keep it straightforward and we're just going to pay in full now. This is probably one of the most important workflows in this full tutorial. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to recreate it from scratch. So we go down here and we click on checkout, edit workflow. I'm going to delete all these and recreate them. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new transaction. So maybe just a reminder, in our database transaction, this is where we keep track of all the payments that are made. It has a number of fields. It has the amount, which is the total value of the transaction. In our case, that's going to be our $17.95. The checkout session ID, we'll see in a second when we're on the Stripe checkout session page, we're going to be pulling that unique ID in just when we identify different transactions. Payment intent ID will be used to track the status of the payment over time. Payment intent status is going to be the description of that payment intent ID. The refund status is going to be whether the payment has been refunded or not. You can see here I'm setting the default here as NA. And then finally the seller account ID. This is the Stripe account ID that the host of the property has. So for example, for John Wayne, you can see here his Stripe account ID is this particular value. So let's go back to our workflow and just build out the next step in that flow. We are going to create a new transaction, like I said. So we're going to create a new thing and we're going to create a transaction. We're going to leave this blank for now. We're not going to change any fields just yet. We will come to that in one of the additional steps in this workflow. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go down to plugins and we're going to go to Stripe Connect, create checkout session. You can see there's two here. There's one checkout session, which is meant to do one-off payments, and there's an additional one that's slightly different that goes into subscription payments. I'm not going to go into that now, but I do have another tutorial I will link to below that goes through how to use this particular workflow action. You can use it to build apps like Substack, where it's a subscription marketplace. So what we're going to do is Stripe Connect, create checkout session, and you'll see we have a bunch of fields to fill out here. We're going to go through these one by one. The very first field we're going to need to fill out is the success URL. This is the URL the user is redirected to after they've completed their payment in the Stripe checkout session. I'm going to keep this very simple for now, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a dynamic piece of data here. I'm going to put in website home URL. So we're going to be redirected to the home page once the payment is complete. We're going to look at how to use this in more complex ways and how to redirect payment complete pages in just a bit. We're going to keep it simple for now. I'm going to make one change to this particular URL. I'm going to put a URL parameter in there. And this is going to allow us to take information from the web page and trigger additional actions once it's in there. It'll become more clear in a minute. All you need to know for now is that involves putting in a question mark, and I'm going to put success equals true at the end of it. I'm going to put exactly the same thing in the cancel URL. As the name would suggest, the cancel URL is where the user is redirected to if they decide to cancel the payment. I'm just going to change the success equals true to cancel equals true. Stripe account ID. So this is the Stripe account ID of the Airbnb host. So what we need to do is we need to figure out a way to get the Airbnb host Stripe account ID from the data that's on this page. And if we just go back to that page, we'll see that I've set the type of data on this page to be trip. And if we go back to our database, we'll see that under trip, each trip has a listing, and each listing has an owner, and the owner is a user type, and they're going to have their Stripe account ID. So we're going to have to go up through a couple of layers of data types to get to what we need, but it's not that difficult. So let's go back, and what we're going to do is we're going to go to parent groups trip, listing, owner, Stripe ID. You could find another way to do this. You could send a host information to the page, but I think this is the most straightforward way in this particular example. So platform fee and price in cents. You'll notice I put cents in both of these brackets here, and that's because Stripe always takes in cents rather than dollars. So if we look at our database and we look at the particular prices we have for each of our trips, you'll notice that it's in the kind of a nominal dollar terms. So this is, $350 per night for $1,750 overall. So we're going to have to do some multiplication to get to cents. And what we're going to do is we're going to say parent groups trips, total price multiplied by 100. And then we're also going to add in plus parent groups trips cleaning fee multiplied by 100. That's going to get us the entire cost of the trip. Now, this is a platform fee. So what this essentially is this is how much of a cut the platform, Airbnb or whatever property rental app you built on Bubble, is going to take. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to add in another multiplication part of this expression. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to more, and I'm going to go to multiplied by 0.2 to get 20% of it. This is the platform fee. We obviously want the overall prices all to go in here, and this is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to copy that, and I'm going to paste it in there, and then I'm going to delete the very last part of that because we're not multiplying it all by 20%. We're just taking the total value itself. Quantity, this is the number of the product or service you're selling. We're going to leave it at 1 in this case. Currency, it has to be a 3-digit ISO code and it has to be supported by Stripe. You can see a full list of the currency supported as a particular link. I'm going to leave US dollars in for now. Product name. This is going to be the name of the product that is displayed on the Stripe checkout page. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put in parent groups trips, listings, address. That's a field I have in the database, is the geographical address of the property. And I think this is a good description for the product name. On behalf of, so this is quite an important field. I've quite a lengthy description here explaining exactly what this is. We have two options. We can set it to yes or no. If we set it to no, then the official merchant that the user is transacting with is going to be the platform, so Airbnb. If we set this to yes, it's going to be the host that is the official merchant that the user is transacting with. You may not think that's a big deal, but there is one really important detail here. If the merchant, the Airbnb host, and the platform, Airbnb, are based in different geographical regions, this will not work if you have the on behalf of set to no. In this particular case, I can set it to no because both my platform, which is qualified for this example, and then also the Airbnb host, they're going to be both based in Ireland, so I'm okay. But play around with this, you can learn more about this particular link. You may want to set it to yes in quite a few cases. Authorize only, we are going to come back to this in a bit. And then Stripe customer ID, that is an optional field. Okay, so we're creating a Stripe checkout session. We now want to make a few changes to the transaction that we created in step one. So we're going to make changes to a thing. We're going to change the transaction in step one. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the amount here to be equal to the result of step two, its checkout session. We're going to change the checkout session ID to be equal to result of step two's checkout session. And we're also going to change the seller account ID, which is the Stripe account ID of the merchant. And we're going to change that to exactly this here. So I can even copy this and put it in here. Oh, wrong one. I can copy this and I'll clear his expression. And then we'll paste in the correct one. One more step, and it's probably the easiest step of the whole process. All we need to do is go to navigation, open an external website, and we want to open up the URL that's created in step number two. So we're going to go to step number two, and it's URL. We can open in a new tab if you want. I don't particularly want to do that, so I'm going to leave that unchecked for now. Let's refresh this page, and what we might do is go back and just start a new one. I can see it's after losing the data here, just because I was playing around with a few things in the background. So let's assume we want to go to this particular property. Let's say we want to do it for those 3 nights. We'll reserve it. We're sending the trip data to the book page. And we're going to pay the full amount now. Let's just click on this. You can see here we're brought to a Stripe checkout session page. And you can see here I've got my numbers wrong because they're charging $72,000 for the full stay. So something's gone wrong in our formula. I'm going to go back in a second and figure out exactly what that is. But this is what you'll be presented with when you create the Stripe checkout session and navigate to that link. Let's go back to that page, and in fact, we're actually going to be brought to the home page. The reason we're being brought to the home page is I put in that cancel equals true parameter you might remember in the cancel URL, and that's where Stripe is sending us to. But let's figure out what we did wrong with the prices in this one here. So if I'm looking at the total amount, I'm getting total price and then multiplying that by 100. I'm adding in the parent group's trips cleaning fee, multiplying that by 100. And let's just go back to our database. I suspect I know what the issue is. If we look at trips, we can see their cleaning fee is 75 and total price is 720. So that looks all right. What I think is going on here, just this extra 100 here is causing a bit of hassle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that 100 inside of the second parenthesis. And then I'm going to delete that and delete that. And I think that should work. I'm also going to do the same thing for this particular one, just in case that's causing an issue on the platform fee. So we're going to put in a multiplied by 100, which means we can get rid of this particular 100 here. And then we get rid of that more fields and that more field again. And we just need to multiply this by 0.2. So let's try that one more time. refresh our page. We'll go for the Spruce Street property once again. We'll go for the 3 nights, reserve that. And we'll pay the full amount now, so $795 is what we're hoping shows up on the Stripe checkout session page this time around. And you can see that worked, so it was just an issue with the expression itself. I'm going to fill out the details here using some dummy data. Okay, so all our data is in, so I'm just going to pay for this reservation. And what we should see now is we're going to be redirected to the home page, and instead of having cancelled equals true in the page URL, we're going to have success equals true. Let's take a quick look at how that looks in our database. If we look at transactions, you can see we've created a new one, and we have the total amount in there in cents. We have the created date, we have the seller account ID, we have the checkout session ID. But what we don't have is we don't have the status of the payment, which has been completed, and we don't have the payment intent ID in there either. So we're going to look at filling out the 2 of these fields next. What I've done is I've built this page which is called payment complete. And maybe let's take a quick look at it in the editor first of all. If you look at the type of data on this page, you'll see the type of content is set again to trip. And what it's doing is it's actually going to get the particular trip data from the page URL. You'll see here the data source for this particular group is searching for trips, and what it's doing is getting the trip from the page URL. This will become more clear in a second, because what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to add another step to the checkout session part of our workflow. So we go back to the book page. If we click on workflow and we look at what's happening here, you'll see at the moment for the success URL, we're just putting in success equals true. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of all that, and I'm going to put in website home URL, and then I'm also going to put in on the end of that payment complete, and I'm going to put in first of all transaction, and I'm going to say equals the result of step 1, its unique ID. So we're creating this transaction in step 1, and then we're sending its unique ID up to the page URL. I'm also going to add in a second parameter, and that second parameter is going to be trip. And I'm going to say trip equals parent group's trip unique ID. Now when we go through our payment flow, we're not going to be redirected to the home page like we are here. We're going to be redirected to that payment complete page, and we're going to be sending this information in the URL itself. Let's take a look at how that's going to work. Go for the Spruce Street property again. Now, one thing to note is you'll see here I'm booking for the same date a number of times. Obviously, you need to put in some sort of workflow to reserve these dates. There's other videos out there on how to do that. I'm just going to focus on the payments aspect of it for now. So again, we're going to go for 3 nights, $795. We're going to check out. Brought to you this nice Stripe checkout page. Just to note, this is the product name that we put in earlier when we were creating our Stripe checkout session. Again, I'm just going to put in these details really quickly, and I'm going to click pay and keep an eye on the URL that we're redirected to this time. Okay, so you can see here there's some valuable information up in this URL. We're getting the unique ID of the transaction, and we're also getting the unique ID of the trip that was created. And that's where all this information here is being pulled down from. You can see if we go back to our editor on the payment complete page, I'll come back to that workflow in a second, this information is coming from the URL. I'm actually going to delete this and just recreate it so you can see it. Type of content is trip. We're going to do a search for trip, and we're going to put in a constraint. And that constraint is the unique ID should equal get data from page URL. The parameter name is going to be trip, and that's how it's going to identify the correct information to pull in. We only want the first item here. There's only going to be one trip with this unique ID, so we're safe enough with that. And then we're simply using the parent group's trip to pull in all the rest of the data that you see on this page here. Let's take a quick look at the Stripe dashboard just to see how that payment went through. And I'm here on the home page. If I look at payments, you'll see here this is the most recent payment we made. where the customer was janebridges@testmail.com. And you can see here the total payment of $795 went through. What we wanted was for 20% of that to go to the platform itself. So if we go to collected fees, you'll see that $159 of that went to the platform, which is 20% of 795. And now I want to go back to our database because you'll see here in the database for this most recent transaction that we've done, we're getting all the information we wanted, but I didn't exactly go through how to show that. You'll see here the payment intent status has changed to succeeded, and the payment intent ID has also been successfully saved down. And the reason we got that was, if you look at the workflow tab of our editor and take a look at this workflow here, I'm actually going to delete it and recreate it. What I'm doing is I'm saying when the page is loaded and when get data from page URL transaction, get rid of that, is not empty. So when there's something in it, then we're going to run this workflow. So we only want to run it when the transaction parameter up here is not empty. And we're doing two things. We are going to make changes to the transaction. But first of all, we have to find that transaction. And the way we find the transaction is we're going to do a search for a transaction. And then we're going to add in a constraint. And much like we did for the trip itself, we're going to find the unique ID. And it's going to equal to get data from the page URL. The parameter name is going to be transaction. And we just want the first item there because again, there's only going to be one transaction that has this unique ID. And we're going to change two things. We are going to change, first of all, the payment intent ID. And what we can do is we can get data from an external API. The external API we're going to use to fill out this field is the Stripe Connect retrieve checkout session details. The checkout session ID is what's required here. And what we're going to do is we're going to put in this transaction's checkout session ID. And then you'll see here there's a whole bunch of data that we can save down. You may wish to save down additional data yourself. I'm only going to save down for now the payment intent, which is this code here. So we have the payment intent now, but what we also need is the payment intent status. We can't get that from the retrieve checkout session details, but what we can do is we can put in a second step here, and we can go to make changes to a thing. We're again going to change the transaction that we have in step one, and this time we're actually going to change the payment intent status. We need to use a slightly different API call for this one, but again, we're going to click on get data from an external API. We're going to use Stripe Connect get payment details. And you'll see here we need the payment intent ID in this case. So we're going to put in this transaction's payment intent ID, which again we will have saved down in step one. And what we're going to do is we're going to go down here to status, and that will save that. So that's how you save down data for the payment intent ID, which we're seeing come through on the database there. Okay, let's move on to refunds. What I'm going to do is I'm going to rerun as John Wayne at testmail.com. You might remember he is the host of some of the properties where people have made reservations. And if we look at his dashboard, what we're going to see is I've built out this transactions tab here. And what this is showing is the information for all the transactions where John Wayne at testmail.com is the merchant or the host. Just to show you how that's working on the design tab, I'm going to go down to that particular part. I'm using a table element here. What I'm doing is I'm searching for all transactions where the seller account ID of the transaction equals the current user's Stripe ID. Now, you will notice that there's quite a bit of information missing here. The first two transactions where we pretty much zero information is quite explainable. You might remember we didn't initially build out the workflow where you pull in the transaction data on the payment complete page, which meant we didn't record any of this data. So that's understandable, but where we are still missing information is for the most recent transaction. You can see here, I don't have anything linking it to the customer or to the particular trip, so there's no real way to identify which transaction we're looking at here, which is important because we're going to build out this refund workflow in a second, and we're going to need to know which customer and which trip we're using for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my database. I'm going to go to data types, And what I'm going to do is I'm going to link a trip to each transaction. So we have our trip data type, we have our transaction data type, and as simple as creating a new field, calling it trip, and adding that trip inside there. Then when we're initially creating our transaction, which we do on the book page, you might remember step one is to create a transaction. When we click on the checkout button, I'm simply going to add in here trip equals parent group's trip. And that'll allow us to go back to our view transactions page to pull in some data here. What we're going to be pulling in is the current rows transactions trip customers email. One thing to note is in order for this to show up fully, you're going to need to go into your database and go into privacy, and you're going to want to tick this box here for email so that people can view customers' emails. The second thing we're going to pull in here is we pull in, also we've created from scratch, current rows transactions, trip, listings, address. So that'll give us a sense of the address of the property that the host is renting out. You could also add in things like start date, end date throughout this, the amount in terms of the value of the trip. I'm just going to leave this for now and move on with the next step. So what we're going to do is I'm going to actually log out as John Wayne at testmail.com and go again as a new user. You can see we don't have this information. I'm going to create a brand new trip just so we can see how this looks when it's fully built out. So we're logged out. I'm going to run as Jane Bridges again, and I'm going to really quickly create another transaction by reserving a property. I'm going to speed through this given you've already seen it a couple of times. Okay, so we paid for that trip. You can see the details are all there. If we go into our bubble database and look at the most recent transaction, we'll have a new one saved down. Payment intent status has succeeded. And then if we go back and instead we run it as our host again, so if we go back to users, run it as John Wayne at testmail.com and check out his dashboard. What we should see now under the transactions tab is the customer's email is coming up and the trip is coming up. Like I said, you may wish to add in start end dates, value in terms of dollars spent, but this is sufficient for our purposes because what we want to do is figure out how to refund this trip. The payment intent status shows that this payment has succeeded, but let's say the customer emails and says they want to cancel. What we're going to do is if we take a look at this refund button here, I'm just going to recreate this from scratch. We're going to need to do two things. The first thing we're going to need to do is go down to plugins, go to Stripe Connect, create a refund, and we're going to need to put in the payment intent ID associated with this transaction. So we're going to go with current rows transactions, payment intent ID. And then we need to put in the amount that we're refunding. So we can put in the full value of the trip or we can put in a partial amount. I'm going to put in the full amount now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to current rows transactions, amount. We can also decide whether to refund the platform fee or not. If you tick yes, then the value, which is 20% of this particular transaction that went to the platform, will be refunded. If not, it will not be. So we can create the refund, but we also want to update the refund status because we need some way of tracking in our bubble database whether the refund went through or not, just in case there was a problem with the Stripe call or our details were incorrect for some reason. So what we need to do is we need to go to data, make changes to a thing. The thing we're changing is the current rows transaction, and we're updating the refund status field. You can see by default here I have it all set to NA, which is supposed to show that no refund has been given. But what we can do is we can put in result of step one, so that's create a refund action, and we can just put in the status. Let's try that out. So we want to refund Jane Bridges at testmail.com. Let's click on that refund action. And you can see here the refund has succeeded. The original payment we know did succeed, but also the refund itself has now succeeded. If we go into the payments part of our bubble dashboard, you can see here the most recent payment for $795 has now been refunded. And the last thing I'm going to show is how you can authorize payment details at one point in time, but not actually capture the payment until a later date. An example here is probably the best way to show this. So we're logged back in as our customer, and let's say we want to reserve a couple nights from the 20th to the 24th. We're going to click reserve and be brought to the book page, and you might have seen earlier that you have two options. You can either pay the full total amount now, or you can pay later. So 2 days before the start date of this rental, in this case, the 18th of August. And if I click on this, I'm just going to show this notice here. I'm just using a conditional statement that says, we'll take your card details, but won't charge you until 18th of August. And what we're actually doing in the workflow here is if we go back to our design tab and click on workflow, what we'll see is that on the checkout button workflow, which is where we're creating the Stripe checkout session, we currently have authorize only set to no. So what's happening here is when this is set to no, we're taking the payment as usual up front. But if we set this to yes, what's going to happen is the payment will be authorized. Stripe will take the card details, but they won't actually charge Jane Bridges until a later date. So let's refresh the page. Let's click on the pay later option and let's go to checkout. This looks exactly the same as any of the other checkout session pages that we've been on. I'm going to fill in the details here really quickly and let's click pay. We're going to be brought to the payment complete page as usual. And I'll just put in a little conditional statement here that's saying you've authorized a payment of $1,445, but it's not going to be processed until the 18th of August, 2 days before the date of arrival. And if we go to the payment section of our Stripe dashboard and just refresh that, what we'll see is the most recent payment, which is this one here, for $1,445, it's uncaptured. So the payment hasn't actually gone through yet. Now, this isn't automatically going to be taken on the 18th of August. What we're going to need to do is to add a backend workflow to ensure that the payment is taken at that time. So I'm just going to go back to the book flow here. And after the checkout session is created, what we're going to do is we're going to put in something here that lets Bubble know that, look, on the 18th of August, you're going to need to take the value associated with this transaction. Now, we're going to need to use a backend workflow, like I said. You're going to need to be on a paid plan to do this. And you're also going to need to go to the settings tab of your Bubble editor, go to API and ensure that this enable workflow API and backend workflows is ticked. I'm also going to tick this hide Swagger API documentation access, nothing to do with this tutorial, but just for good practice. And then I'm going to go to my backend workflows. And you see, I already have one built here called capture payment. What I'm going to do is I'm going to recreate this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to new API workflow. I'm going to call it capture customer payment. We don't need to expose this as a public API workflow. What we are going to do is we're going to need to pass on the transaction as a key, just so we know exactly what transaction we're looking at here. So we're going to say key is transaction, the type is going to be a transaction, and then we're going to make changes to a transaction. But before that, we actually need to trigger the payment itself. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to go to plugins, capture payment, and we're going to go to transaction payment intent ID. That's what we need to put in here to capture the payment intent ID. And then let's say that we do indeed capture the payment. We want to update the payment intent ID accordingly. You would have seen in the database there, requires capture is the current status. So what we need to do is we need to update this to succeeded if the payment does indeed go through. So what we're going to do is we're going to make changes to a thing. We're going to change the transaction, and then we're going to update that payment intent ID to get data from an external API, retrieve payment details. The payment intent is going to be this transaction's payment intent ID, and we're just going to update the status. So now we have this built, we can delete the old one, and instead of doing it for 7 days in the future, what we're just going to do for example purposes here is if we go back to our book page and we look at that flow, we are going to insert an action between creating the checkout session and making changes. what we're going to do is we're going to go to custom events, schedule API workflow. The API workflow is capture customer payment. The schedule date, you can put in a few things here. What you could do is you could say parent group's trips, start date, and then you could say take 2 days away from that. You could say plus days, put in -2. Sorry, I'm after making an error there. But you could say plus days, -2. And then this workflow will be triggered 2 days before the trip actually starts. Now, what you are going to see me do in this example is I'm just going to put in the current date and time. And I'm going to put that in, and then I'm going to add on, let's say we're going to add on 2 minutes just to give ourselves enough time to go through the flow. And then transaction is going to be the transaction that we're creating in step 1. Okay, so let's do another demo of this. We're going to refresh our page. We're still logged in as janebridges@testmail.com. And let's go to another transaction. We're going to reserve this place, and we'll do it from the 28th to the 30th of August. Reserve that, and we're going to pay later this time. So let's go to checkout. And once we hit checkout, we're also going to trigger the backend workflow. So I'm going to click checkout. That's going to create the Stripe checkout session. We're going to see that in a second. But we're also going to see, if we go to our logs here, is the scheduler. You'll see here we scheduled that backend workflow for 2 minutes time. It's now 2:22. It's scheduled for 2:24. I'm going to quickly put in this info, and let's pay for that reservation. Okay, so our trip has been successful. It's going to be processed on, I haven't updated the date there, but if we go into our database, what we'll see is that at the moment that payment intent status is showing require capture. But if we wait a couple of minutes, and I'm just going to put in the time clock, you'll see now it is 2:23. So if we just wait for this backend workflow to run, we're going to see that that is going to hopefully capture the payment and then also update the status. Let's take a look at our Stripe dashboard while we're waiting. Most recent amount was for $745, again done at 2:22. So let's just wait until we get to 2:24. Okay, so it's now past 2:24, and if we go back to our scheduler, you'll see that that backend workflow has now run. So hopefully we're going to see two things. We're going to see that number one, in our database, the payment intent status has been updated, and number two, in Stripe, the payment has been captured. Let's refresh our Stripe dashboard first and see if that's gone through. You can see it succeeded. So that payment has gone through. And let's take a look at our database and refresh the data. And you can see there the payment intent ID has changed from the payment intent ID to succeeded. Okay, so that was clearly an error I made. I updated the payment intent ID rather than the payment intent status. The way I did that was, if I just go back to that backend workflow, what I should have done here is instead of the payment intent ID, it should have been payment intent status, and then get data from external API, Stripe Connect, get payment details, this transactions, payment intent ID, and then status there. But hopefully you see how that works in principle. The other thing I'll say is you may not wish to automatically trigger this after a certain amount of time. What you could do is, and this is going to be the last demonstration in this tutorial, but if you go to view transactions, and instead of say this being a refund button, let's just say we want to capture payment. And instead of actually creating a refund here, let's just get rid of that. Maybe what we want to do is we want to go down to our plugins actions here. We want to capture the payment manually via the dashboard of the host. So what I would put in here is current rows transactions, payment intent ID, and then we would make changes to current rows transaction. And this is where we're not going to make the same mistake we did last time. We're updating the payment intent status, and it's going to be get data from external API, Stripe Connect, get payment details, this transaction's payment intent ID, and then we're going to get the status. So let's do this as our last demonstration in the tutorial. I'm going to once again create a new payment as janebridges@testmail.com. One thing I do want to change very quickly is there's no point in scheduling a backend workflow for 2 minutes in the future if we're just doing it manually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this workflow here. I'm going to refresh my page, and for our last booking of the tutorial, we're going to go for Dutch Street, and let's do it on 14th September until the 19th of September, total of 1795, and we're going to pay later again. So we're going to go to checkout, and I'll put these details in again very quickly, and let's pay for that. And then we should see a payment for 1795 come through on our Stripe dashboard, but it should be uncaptured. And you can see there it is indeed uncaptured. But what we can do if we want to capture that is let's do it from the host dashboard. So let's run it as the user johnwayne@testmail.com. Let's go to his dashboard and look at the transactions. And you can see here, this is the most recent one. It requires a capture. So what I'm hoping is going to happen here is we click this capture payment button. The payment's going to go through on Stripe, and then the payment intent status is going to change from requires capture to succeeded. Let's see if that works. Okay, this looks good. It has gone to succeeded. And if we refresh our Stripe dashboard, we'll see it's gone through here as well. So this can be really useful, maybe not specifically for Airbnb, but for things like services where the merchant needs to perform a service and then the payment is going to get triggered, or a good needs to be delivered and then the payment manually gets triggered. That's the kind of thing where this can be useful. Hope this tutorial has been useful. If you do have any questions, let me know in the comments section.